Welcome to this 20th episode of the Panelfit monthly charts. Today we are here with Gry Hasselbalch. So good morning, Gry.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for accepting our invite. So a very short introduction because I don't think our guest needs long introductions. She is a co-founder of the DataEthics project and lead investigator of the Data Pollution and Power Initiative. Just to mention the two more recent, I would say, activities, but you will correct me. And she was also a member of the EU Commission's high-level expert group on AI. And among the many things she worked on and published, there is this very interesting book, Data Ethics, The New Competitive Advantage, co-authored by Pernille Tranberg. Which is very interesting because it is from 2016, which is, 5 years are a very long time span in speaking of technology in general, but it is, it is still relevant today. Their contents are very, very relevant still, because, for instance, couple of things that gained my attention were like where you write the elite will spearhead a new market for privacy tech, just as we have seen it with green tech, which is something that is actually happening today. I would say with green economy in general. Nowadays, and also where you say you push for people to demand their rights to control on their data, which is something that nowadays is, I would say, quite renowned as an issue. At least there are some organizations like EDRI or Privacy International that were already present and active in those days, but now they are, they operate on another level. And also very interesting, the fact that you spotted an issue of that data-driven business model that was established in those years. And so the fact that it was an issue wasn't that obvious 5 years ago as it is now. So that was my personal remarks on this book before going into the topic of this chart, which is data pollution and power dynamics. And so I will start by asking you about definitions. Because I read a report meeting that you wrote for the project Data Pollution and Power, where you define data pollution as you gave quite a broad definition, but you mentioned it as the interrelated adverse effects of the data of AI and the power dynamics that shape the field. So I would like you to tell us a bit more about this definition and the discussion you're having in your work group.
Yes, of course. So, I can say a little bit more also about the Data Pollution and Power Initiative. As you said, it's established at the Bonn University at the Sustainable AI Lab, which was established by Amy van Winsberg, that I actually worked together with in the high-level group on AI. And so, generally, this project is a kind of it's a component of this larger debate on the sustainability of AI. The discussions right now are very much about, how can we use AI for sustainable development goals, and then what is being looked at this Sustainable AI Lab, and also what we're trying to look at in terms of the Data Pollution Power Initiative is also looking but AI in itself, and the data that is being used for AI. How can we ensure that by itself is also sustainable? So not only looking, how can we look at AI used for sustainable goals, but how is AI sustainable or unsustainable in many ways? And so, of course, when I look at data pollution, I come from a background, as you noticed yourself, and as you were noting yourself in your introduction, is a background where I started. We were looking at, taking point of departure very much also, as you said, in the point of departure in these civil society organizations focus on at the beginning it was very much the privacy implications of big data and this online economy that we were seeing being developed. So I started looking at data in terms of these kind of effects on individual lives and social spheres and our democratic rights, fundamental rights, and these things. But if we take a more holistic approach to data and the data of AI, then we can think about all kinds of adverse effects that all in some way are interrelated on different spheres. Not only our social and individual environments, like the effects on our privacy rights, but also on things like the CO2. For example, we can talk about the CO2 emissions of huge data centers that are processing a lot of data that goes into some of these AI systems that we're building. So we're basically looking at as data as data and data pollution in the same way as we looked at smog in the industrial age, where we have particular kind of adverse effects on the way our natural environment is, and in our social environments and our individual environments. So that's the way, with data pollution. If we talk about data pollution, it's been defined. I think it was Bruce Schneier, a technologist and a security expert, who originally talked about the biggest or the pollution problem of the big data age was the effects that these business models, data business models, had on privacy. But now later we've started to expand this notion of also looking at what kind of effects it has on our natural environment. And then if we want to look at it, how all of these things are interrelated, then we can think about some of the power dynamics that kind of shape the way we design technologies and the way we frame them in terms of regulatory approaches and the way that we invent things, and also our response as users and consumers of these products. So as you said yourself before, it's not too many years ago, there wasn't too much talk about the privacy implications or the adverse effects of these big tech organizations and institutions, or big tech infrastructures that we took part in when we used social media, for example, and these things. But nowadays, it's getting much more normal to actually have a response and think about it and worry about how your data is used. So these things are changing. So we can think of data pollution, as I said, and the responses that we're seeing and the environmental awareness we're having as similar to some of the kind of environmental awareness and movements we had even back in the 1970s and later on, and also today that we're having today. Just more interrelated things.
Yeah, it's interesting that seems like when the general discussion goes where the researchers point their finger, and then you suddenly find another empty spot to be investigated, because so that somehow you guide this holistic approach in the whole field. It's very interesting and useful, I'd say.
Yeah, it's
And
like if you lift a stone, there'll always be one other stone that falls to the ground. So the thing of, and that's very much also how we have to think of technologies today is that it's not that you can focus on one thing. Let's fix one technical problem, for example. If you fix one thing, you'll create another problem somewhere else. And so we have to think more holistically about how we solve problems in terms of these kind of social technical transformations that we're having with big data and AI. So.
yeah, yeah. And before going forward, I remind the audience that you are allowed to ask questions if you want. So please, in any moment of the discussion, raise your hand or type your question in the text chat as you prefer. So let's try to make this a bit more interactive. Um, in the same report, you suggest that we look at the power dynamics of data pollution at different scales of time and levels of analysis. And yeah, I found very interesting this view. Can you please explain us this framework?
Yeah, I can. So it's very much connected with what I said before, this thing with the holistic approach, because so this is it's very traditional, for example, in sociology. As a sociologist, that you look at society in different ways. So you can either look at individuals and communities and how they act and try to interpret society like that, or you can look at institutions and laws, how they're created. And then there's these kind of, you can call them macro structures that shape some of these other levels of interaction. So you can think about grander narratives about the progress of technology, or you can think about grander political ideas or global discourses that somehow influence the other levels. So when we look at data pollution, then we can look at data pollution from different angles. So we can look at, for example, at how an individual designer, an AI designer, how they, for example, if you want them to consider sustainable use of data, then you have to think about what kind of power dynamics are they interacting with. For example, if you're building using particular software, particular clouds, particular data sets for your AI, then it's very it does a lot to what you can actually do. If you are, for example, restrained to using the clouds of one big tech actor, for example, it means a lot in terms of the choice you can make in terms of what kind of data processing capabilities you're using, or the kind of even to understand the CO2 emissions, if you want to talk about effects on the natural environment, to understand what kind of effects of the different AI models that you use. So at a very micro level, you can think about the restraints or even the opportunities. What are the barriers? What are the enablers at this kind of design level for tackling data pollution? And if we really want to have a more sustainable use of data of AI or sustainable design processes. And then there's this, as I call it, the mesoscale, that is also really important, or the medium scale, the scale that I talked about at a more kind of an institutional level. So, for example, you can look at some of the requirements, the standards, and the technical requirements for works that are implemented by companies, or you can think of look at laws, how they're negotiated, and governments. If we think about the data protection reform in the EU, there were certain interests and certain power dynamics that were shaping the result of this law. And here you can also equally think about what are the barriers, what are the enablers for this kind of institutional organizational or even governmental or legal way of tackling data pollution to achieve sustainable AI. And then, as I said before, the macro scale of time. Right now, if we look at, for example, some of the discussions that are going on a global kind of geopolitical level, there's this kind of, we're talking about the competition between, for example, the EU, who is promoting with, for example, a new AI Act and legislation, what we call trustworthy AI, and with particular requirements to different uses of AI, and with a particular definition of AI also, and with different levels of risk levels in terms of AI. And this is somehow competing with other regional approaches to AI that might be less focused on the trustworthiness of AI and more focused on, for example, economic achievements or efficiency or using AI for controlling citizens and these things. So we can look at all of these different levels that I talked about before in this framework, a more geopolitical and more macro perspective, also looking at, for example, technological progress in general. So where are we in terms of the general development of internet technologies and digital technologies? So we talked about, as I said before, there was used to be not too much awareness about the implications of this kind of database business models. And now suddenly we are having this momentum for discussion about the adverse effects of some of these technologies. We are having various ethics groups being developed and established with negotiations about, what role should technologies play in our lives? What are the fundamental values? We're having all of this kind of on a macro scale right now, a kind of general discussion that seems to be cutting across all the other levels that I talked about before. And in the very end, there's competing geopolitical powers competing about what kind of narrative do we want to shape this progress with. And in the end, this is also a question of power dynamics. Which narrative will prevail? Is it the narrative about trustworthy ethical AI? Is it the narrative about economic progress and general AI uptake? This is up for conversation right now. So that's also a power negotiation. So holistically, we can look, and we should look at all those different levels where data pollution is either where it's being created or where it's being tackled in different ways.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Also, with reference with the last thing you were saying, also that the issue of the unavoidability of some technical improvements that seems like since something is possible on a technological level, then we should somehow take for granted that it will be with us forever. So, and then maybe we start to regulate it. I was thinking, for instance, to the facial recognition issue, which is currently debated in Europe, and recently Facebook said that it won't use anymore its algorithm to recognize people in photos, etc. So
I don't think they said they were deleting the pictures that were already, but I don't think they said they would not use the algorithm. Actually, the whole point is that they want the algorithm. So there's another power.
Yeah.
There's a lot of surface conversations, a lot of PR, and then there's the actual power behind the whole thing.
Yeah. But I mean, at least we see that they are aware of the issue, so they are they are saying they will do something, which is
they have to, because there's too much pressure right now. No, but I agree with that's actually where we are right now in the both in the policy debate, at least in Europe, and also in kind of the social debate and the public debate we have right now. It's the thing that not everything has to be created just because it can be created, and we've been there before in history where we've seen the limits not only not the limits, but we've actually made decisions about, and this is very much often, ethical conversations about where do we put the limits? Where do we not want to go as a society? So, for example, in Europe, now I also work as an ethics reviewer on the formerly it was called the Horizon 2020 program, but the kind of financial program for the EU that finances research in different areas. And for example, we've already had, there are things that the EU does not finance. For example, you have CRISPR-Cas9 for human gene editing is something that cannot be funded, it cannot be used. There's a red line there. And we can have the same conversation about AI and data technologies that are things that we say, okay, this does not fit in the kind of ethical frame, in the foundational values of our society, the way that we want, the kind of society that we want to live in. And the conversation on facial recognition is a very good example here. There are limits to what kind of society we want to live in. So anyone knows Minority Report, the film, and those kind of, but it's not really science fiction, much of that. A lot of these kind of predictive technologies that can catch your face or catch your movements and then predict that you might be up to something or suspicious, or you look suspicious. The example of the man in the United States, Mr. Williams. His name is Robert Williams, actually, who gets. The police comes to his house, picks him up, and he spends the night in the police station. And the next day, and he hasn't committed any crimes or anything. The next day, the police shows him a picture of another man who's black like himself, but doesn't look like him at all. But he's been matched with the face of this man who was a criminal who committed a crime. And those are the kind of infrastructures that we're building where we can possibly suddenly be exposed to some kind of danger. And the problem is very often, or some kind of risk, the danger is very often that many of these technologies that we're building are reinforcing some of the biases we have in society. So of course, Mr. Williams here, he has to, I remember he asks the police officer, I read the news article, he says, so you think all black men look the same? The facial recognition system thinks so. Probably the police officer doesn't think so. So those are the kind of things we want to see. How much power do we give to these kind of biased technologies that are actually much more stupid than intelligent very often, no? So.
Yeah, or at least as stupid as human beings.
And then hopefully.
Which is not a little sometimes.
Yeah, but we have the potential to be not stupid, no? I think so.
Yeah, I agree.
And critical, so that's important.
Yeah. Another comment that popped up while you were speaking is that sometimes, let's be aware that these kind of issues don't involve only AI. Sometimes I'm thinking, for instance, about border control databases in Europe. So we had a chat some months ago with an ethics researcher on that particular issue. And I mean, in that field, to date, there isn't a strong application of technologies that we can call AI. I think I wouldn't. I hope I don't.
There is actually conversations about how, and there is the for example, there's the EUDAC, there's the database that is being used to store at least biometric data on people, and there is the conversation about applying facial recognition to this too. And actually also including biometric data on children down to, I think, don't take me on the word, I think it was down to 6 or 8 years old. So there are conversations about evolving these systems right now, and proposals to do this in Europe. So it's there. I mean, the technologies are there and they're almost being applied, and that's why it's so important that we have these conversations right now. That's also why I think the AI Act is a really important act, because it's good to have these conversations right now before they're actually deployed. No.
Yeah, I think we more or less anticipated a couple of topics I had in my questions list, but one question I would like to ask anyway is about the awareness that you see about these issues, both in the research field and among policymakers. I mean, what is also the evolution you saw in the years? Because I mean, you and your colleagues are talking about these topics since some years, and I guess the approach and the feedback you had has changed over time. So, and also speaking about your experience in the European Commission's group.
Yeah. Yeah, I can say, I mean, I always like to look at this historically because in that sense, I can be positive, no? Because I can see changes in attitudes and I can see changes in awareness. And it's something that me and Pernille in our book, we predicted. That's why we talked about data ethics as a competitive advantage in 2016, because we wanted to tell companies that they had to change their behavior because we saw a movement. We saw a movement among people and consumers that were starting to worry. It was very much also, particularly when the Snowden revelations, that was the first grand opening, both of policy makers' eyes in Europe, but also ordinary consumers that started thinking, hey, there's something going on with my data that I wasn't really aware of. There's some powers that I don't like having involved in my everyday life. The idea that a foreign intelligence service is actually collecting my data in my private life. So I mean, we saw a movement starting in 2013. That was the Snowden revelations. But in 2012, there was already the negotiations of the General Data Protection Framework, or at least the communication came out. And I mean, of course, there was a lot of interest invested in this. And I remember when it came out, one of the first reactions from most people I would meet at most conferences, apart from the actors that you're mentioning, EDRI and Privacy International and those kind of, but in most contexts, every time you would walk into a room talking about digital media and data and these things, they would say, well, privacy, it's just no longer a social norm. It's an obstacle to big data innovation. It was the same reaction to the GDPR proposal when it came out, or the communication. The first reaction I saw from big industry players in particular, that would say, well, this is just another administrative burden. It's gonna limit our competitive advantage in Europe. And so me and Pernille, we tried to make this counter argument. No, look around, look at what people are asking for. They're actually worried. I worked with youth beforehand, and I remember a lot of young people that they had to be on Facebook because otherwise they didn't have a social life. But they were actually only accepting not to have a private life because they thought they had to accept that. They said, otherwise we can't have our social life. But actually, they found it valuable to have things to themselves and not being tracked by big tech or their parents, or for that matter, or anyone, no? And so we could see that movement. And we could also see there was some healthy kind of thinking in some companies where you started, for example, we did some interviews. I had an interview with one kind of doll designer who was making internet connected dolls, which anyone who, we all say every time we hear that, because we've heard the terrible stories about dolls that's been hacked and surveilling kids. And I think there's even the Kayla doll, the famous one, is in a spy museum in Germany now because it can be used for, so there were all these stories. But this one, he was a German, he was very made these wooden dolls that were connected to the internet. But as he said, when I asked him, so what is privacy by design to you? He said, well, it was kind of just a value I had from the beginning, because I was thinking about my privacy aware consumers, that they wouldn't like if I had a microphone in the doll. He didn't include a microphone in the doll. It was just internet connected. So, and he was of course happy when we talked to him about that, because then there was all the stories about hacked dolls and so on. So there were, companies already thinking about this, but it wasn't the biggest and most popular, and it wasn't a popular discourse to talk about privacy. It was always considered, it's something that's complicated, it limits our business model, and these things. But then, of course, we had so many stories like the Snowden revelations. We had the Cambridge Analytica that everyone remembers, where suddenly people are aware that they can actually be micro-targeted and manipulated, which most people have been for years, but no one was really aware of it. And there was all kinds of stories of, you probably remember also the Snapchat, I think it was hacks, with a lot of kids and young people's personal images and things being shared and things. So there was so many of these stories. And that meant that right now, after this whole process where we've also had the negotiation of different law proposals and the GDPR, then right now we are having a kind of healthy conversation about the ethical implications that we didn't have before. And so you asked about the high-level group, getting to that point. Don't ever get me started on things, because then I never stop. So when I start thinking about history, I get like an old grandma who tells long stories, no? No, so in the high-level group, when I got to that point, which was in 2018, you have to remember that I have been part of that stories. I was part of the internet governance debate. We made the privacy as innovation sessions at the Internet Governance Forum all over the world for many, many years. And at that time, every time we had these kind of multi-stakeholder or expert groups and things, it was always uphill. There was always someone saying, but this is, it's not relevant to talk about these values. Even the thing of getting human rights, I mean, I don't want to take the honor for that. There has been fantastic, even, some of the founders of EDRI, Maya Masuki, or Rikke Frank Jørgensen, or those kind of people that had to fight to get these kind of ideas that something like human rights were relevant to talk about in the context of internet technologies. So imagine that. And then we got to the high-level group, where I actually, for the first time, sat at a table where we had business people and we had civil society agents and these things, and we could actually agree that the human-centric approach was the best approach, and that fundamental rights would be the point of departure. So for me, of course, I see it in that as a kind of positive change. And then there's all the details, there's negotiations, there's always negotiations. And I don't see stakeholder negotiations as just two groups like industry and civil society. There's actually also within the industry, as I just said before, there's also negotiations. There's the companies that are much more aware of the data ethical impact of their technologies. And there's other companies that have other interests. And so even within stakeholder industry, stakeholder groups, there's negotiations. And there's negotiations between, academic disciplines, philosophy or sociology, which is the right approach. Or you will have negotiations between civil society actors. What's the most important to focus on? Whose rights should we promote in an ethical framework? So I mean, if you look at it, now we go back to the thing I talked about, macro conversations. Then you can look at the micro conversations within the high-level group and see, yes, there are things that might be not like would be the ideal. But at the same time, we also have to look at it, this kind of macro historical development where we started from not at all being aware of the impact of big data and AI, not at all being interested in the ethical issues, going into this more constructive conversation that includes both the industry and civil society actors and different academic disciplines. And in that sense, I see it as a kind of it's a good starting point. It was a good platform.
Great, thank you. I always appreciate also this positive approach that stems also from the book, from your 2016 book. I mean, it's good also to acknowledge that there are some achievements besides all the issues. So just a personal remark. Okay, many other comments popped up while you were talking, but I'd like to stay within our like 40 minutes framework, more or less. So I'd go straight with this with the last question. And once again, it's last chance if someone from the audience wants to ask a question. Do it now or never. And so yeah, the last question is a bit more could be like a sort of side story of this whole issue, but I guess it's very relevant if we take a holistic approach, as you were saying, and it is about the ethic group and researchers funding ties, let's say, with big tech companies. For starters, do you think there is an issue here? And if so, is it part of this data pollution problem?
Yeah, I actually think there is an issue, but I think that the issue has been there for many years. I mean, there's always been. I mean, one of the biggest lobbies in the GDPR and the General Data Protection Regulation negotiation was the big tech actors that we know, the Facebooks, the Googles, and Microsoft. There were some of the, when you hear the stories of some of the commissions or some of the parliamentarians, they were targeted very heavily by big tech actors, and of course it's a big lobby, and I think. I mean, one of the things that I can say is that it's something that, for example, in DataEthics.eu, we've always been very aware of. From the very beginning, we have, for example, never taken any funding, and that's not easy for an NGO working in this field to not getting. And that this goes back to from when we were funded. We've never taken any funding from Facebook, Google, Microsoft, whatever. Any of these, I wouldn't say Microsoft is, but Google and Facebook and Amazon and these big tech actors, we haven't really had any funding from any of those. And we made a kind of decision on that from the beginning. And I think, I mean, mostly it was a statement, because it's not that I think that you cannot, as a researcher or as an NGO, not be an independent, but I think it's really important that we consider what kind of foundations and what kind of interest are invested in both in front, but also in the back of what we're doing. No, so I think that that of course it's problematic that you have. Maybe I think both in funding, but also in terms of one of the things that I have seen very much throughout my career, also in the internet governance community, is this kind of there used to always be a lot of big tech actors, for example, that would be very cozy and friendly with everyone at every event. And when you become too friendly and cozy with these actors, it will be more difficult to be critical. And that, I think, is more problematic. I mean, I've seen situations where people are maybe very friendly because, people are also nice when they work for big tech, and not everyone has bad intentions. There's also a lot of people with good ideas. But then at the same time, it becomes more difficult to be critical when you then later have to debate or talk about things. So I think this, the general... I'm not saying that I'm not totally for the idea that any researcher or any group that has had kind of, I don't call it ties, but funding or whatever, cannot be independent. But I do think it does have a very important influence on which table are you eating at. When you have to have meetings in political context, you will have meetings at your own place very often, because then you're in a powerful position. It's the same thing if you have a critical conversation. It's more difficult to have a critical conversation about big tech and the influence of their business models if you're sitting at the table of big tech. So this is why I think it's something we really have to consider in terms of funding. And it's something, as I said, it's something we considered very specifically in data ethics, and saying, okay, but we need to kind of not have these ties because we have to be able to feel free to say whatever we want. So I think that it's very much connected with power dynamics, but it's not as clear cut as the debates on industry versus civil society usually are. I'm not very fond of the very kind of unnuanced debates we sometimes have. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's of course it's not a yes/no answer to this
No, I
issue.
think we always have anything that is a power economy is a form of power. So and it never even if you're a big tech company, you say you put no restraints on your researchers, you still have to say that you're providing the table that the researcher or the critical agent is sitting at, and that will have some kind of effect on how you're thinking, what you're doing. Think of it by the concept that now this is a network of journalists, no? Or and I mean, think of the concept of embedded journalists. I think very much it's the same experience that I had with with that kind of framework that the big tech actors have been creating, not only in terms of funding, but also in terms of interactions and these things for the critical debates that we need. So I think it's important that there's a distance between the actors that we're criticizing and the non-critical actors, or the critical actors. No, yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I see this. It's very apparent also in journalism, as you were saying, but also because many festivals and journalistic prizes, etc., are promoted, organized, and funded by the Google News Initiative, for instance, or Facebook is often one of the sponsors. So it's, I mean, not that they explicitly tell you that you can't do or say or investigate on them, but it's always a tool of soft power. I don't think we can.
Soft power, exactly. That's the point. I mean, the same. I have so many memories of things where there's been Google or Facebook promoting their services to a certain community of activists or exactly as you say, journalists or something, and then you create that kind of normality around using these services and not using other services. I remember being at an event where there was I don't know how many Google services promoted to civil society agents, and then there was one agent or one company coming from a small enterprise in Europe actually wanting to present a phone that was at that time, it's many years ago, that was privacy by default and actually attacking directly big tech. And this one company was actually pushed out and considered promoting their services and everything because they were doing it more directly than these other tech. They were saying, "Oh, we're giving you a free service." It's the same with the social media. It's a free service. You don't have to use it, but then it becomes the infrastructure of your life. It's the same with funding. It ties anything. Anyone can be independent. I believe that everyone can be critical, but there's really something that shapes the environment that you live in that then might tie you up a little bit more and make you less critical in some senses. And we have to be really aware of this.
Yeah, I think it's a very good statement to end our conversation, which was very, very interesting and full of insights. So thank you very much, Gry, for being with us.
Thank you for having me here.